November 1860. The Republican Party has nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate for president. Lincoln has promised not to interfere with slavery where it already exists, but the Republicans are opposed to the expansion of slavery, and the election of Lincoln provokes a bitter reaction from many Southerners who are convinced that he will act to abolish slavery and destroy the Southern economy. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union, and by February 1st, 6 more states have followed. In early February 1861, representatives of the seceding states meet in Montgomery, Alabama, to form their own national government, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi cotton planter and a former United States Senator, is elected provisional president of the Confederacy. 3 weeks later in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln rides to his inauguration as President of the United States. In his inaugural address, Lincoln urges the seceding states to reconsider their action. He holds that secession is illegal, and as president, he must enforce federal law in all the states. And he warns the South, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." The issue of war and peace may well hinge on the fate of Fort Sumter, which guards the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter is still controlled by the Union, in spite of Southern demands that it be turned over to the Confederacy. In Washington, on the day after the inauguration, Lincoln receives an urgent message from the commander of Fort Sumter. Unless food supplies are received soon, the fort must be surrendered. After 4 weeks of cautious deliberation, Lincoln orders the shipment of food supplies to the fort. April 12th, 1861. News of Lincoln's decision has provoked the Confederacy to open fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War has begun. After 2 days of bombardment, the Union troops are forced to abandon the fort. The fall of Fort Sumter produces a series of strong reactions. Virginia is one of 8 slave states that have remained in the Union. But 3 days after the fall of Fort Sumter, a Virginia convention votes to secede. With the loss of Virginia, Washington, D.C. is now on the very border of the Confederacy, with no protection against an invasion by Southern troops. President Lincoln has issued a call for 75,000 militia to be recruited by the loyal states. The response is enthusiastic, but it will take several days for troops to reach Washington. April 19th, 1861. In Baltimore, Maryland, a group of Confederate sympathizers attacks the 1st Union Regiment to approach the nation's capital. Maryland is a slave state, and many of its citizens favor secession. Lincoln will establish military rule in Baltimore to prevent the loss of this strategic state. Meanwhile, other slave states are considering secession. In addition to Virginia, 3 more states in the Upper South join the Confederacy by early June. Remaining in the Union are 4 slave states, plus a part of Virginia, later to become the state of West Virginia. With Union troops now guarding Washington, President Lincoln has issued a second call for the enlistment of Northern men into the Army. And many Northern women have also volunteered their services for the Union war effort. A meeting in New York City, attended by more than 3,000 women, has led to the organization of the United States Sanitary Commission, which will provide vital supplies and services for the welfare of the Union troops. Dorothea Dix has received the approval of the Surgeon General for her proposal to form a corps of women nurses. Many Northern blacks have also offered to support the war effort and have been hired as Army cooks and laborers. The War Department has refused to allow blacks to become soldiers, fearing that the slave states still in the Union would be offended if blacks were allowed to carry weapons. And many Northern whites would refuse to fight alongside black soldiers. July 1861. The Union Army consists largely of raw recruits, not yet properly trained. But 3 months have passed since the fall of Fort Sumter, and the people of the northern states are eager for a major military action against the South. Lincoln agrees to a plan for a Union offensive to capture Richmond, Virginia, the new Confederate capital. The first step will be an attack on the main body of Southern troops stationed at Manassas Junction near Bull Run. Commanding the opposing forces are 2 former West Point classmates, Union General Irvin McDowell and Confederate General Pierre Beauregard. Aspiring in Washington, D.C., has provided Beauregard with information on the movements of the Union troops. When the 2 armies meet on July 21, 1861, the Confederates are prepared and reinforcements have begun to arrive. But enthusiasm for the war effort has led Union troops to expect a swift, easy victory. In the first hours of the battle, the Union offensive forces Southern troops to begin a retreat. But one Confederate brigade, led by General Thomas Jackson, stands its ground like a stone wall. And as the last of the Southern reinforcements join the battle, the Confederates rally and take the offensive. At first, the Union retreat is gradual and orderly, but soon the raw recruits begin to panic. Confused and frightened, the Northern troops begin a frantic escape from the battlefield back to Washington. The Union has learned a bitter lesson. Victory will not come easily, and preparations must be made for a long and difficult struggle. And for that long struggle, it appears that the North has several advantages. The Union armies will be recruited from a population of over 22 million. The northern states have an extensive network of railroad lines, strategically located to bring troops and supplies to the battlefront. A well-developed mining industry to tap the many deposits of coal and metal ore in the northern states, and a manufacturing industry that can be mobilized for mass production of arms, ammunition, and other supplies. The industrial resources of the North outweigh those of the South by about 10 to 1. The Confederacy must recruit its armies from a total population of 9.5 million, less than half that of the Union. About 1/3 of the Southern population consists of slaves, and they are not allowed to carry weapons. With its limited industrial development, the South must import most of its arms and ammunition from England and France. This means that vital supply lines of the Confederacy are on the high seas and on the Mississippi River. Transportation by water is much slower than by rail. In spite of these handicaps, the Confederacy appears to have some important advantages. Most of the world's cotton comes from the southern states. By restricting the export of cotton, Southern leaders hope to put pressure on the nations of Europe to persuade them to help the Confederacy in its fight for independence. Another advantage for the South is the high caliber of its military leaders. General Robert E. Lee is one of several brilliant officers who have resigned from the United States Army to support the Confederacy. Confederate field commanders, following the strategy developed by Lee and President Davis, intend to fight a mainly defensive war. This will give them the advantages of fighting on familiar terrain and keeping their supply lines short. They expect the North to eventually tire of fighting a continually offensive war. Meanwhile, Union commanders will follow a strategy approved by President Lincoln for action on 2 battlefronts. One in the east, aimed at Richmond, the Confederate capital, and a second front in the west to take control of the major rivers that are vital to the South. There will be no major land battles during the remainder of 1861. Time is needed to properly train the new recruits. But another part of the Union strategy is already in effect, a blockade of southern seaports. Several ships carrying supplies for the Confederacy have been captured by Union gunboats. As a result, many types of goods have become scarce in the South. But the blockade is not entirely effective. arms and ammunition have been delivered from Europe to the Confederacy by swift ships called blockade runners because they can outrun Union gunboats. Up to this time, all ships have been made of wood. But in the summer of 1861, the Union Navy receives a spy report from a woman who has observed something new in a Confederate shipyard. A damaged warship called the Merrimac has been rebuilt and covered with iron sheeting that cannot be pierced by gunfire. The Union quickly constructs its own ironclad warship, the Monitor, and on March 9th, 1862, the two ironclads meet at Hampton Roads, Virginia. In a 4-hour battle, neither ship can seriously damage the other. It is the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. Wooden ships will soon become obsolete. Finally, even though the battle is a draw, the Confederate ship will retreat and the Union blockade will remain in place. Meanwhile, Union forces on the Western Front have begun a major campaign against Confederate positions. In February 1862, Union gunboats move into the Tennessee River to attack Fort Henry. The naval bombardment will be coordinated with the advance of Union infantry for a land-based attack on the Confederate fort. After capturing Fort Henry, Union gunboats and land troops attack Fort Donelson and force the Confederates to surrender. The Union victory opens the way for an invasion of western Tennessee, and General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the land forces in the river campaign, has become a popular hero in the northern states. From Fort Donelson, Grant marches his army to the village of Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. He plans to wait here for reinforcements before attacking a large enemy force at Corinth, Mississippi. At Pittsburgh Landing, Grant is convinced that the enemy has been demoralized by its recent losses, and he has not set up adequate defenses. April 6, 1862. A sudden rebel attack begins the Battle of Shiloh. After a full day of confused and bloody fighting, the Union reinforcements finally arrive, and Grant launches a counterattack, forcing the Confederates to retreat. The North has won an important but costly victory. Union casualties number 8,000 wounded and 1,700 killed in the Battle of Shiloh. Farther south, at the mouth of the Mississippi, the naval war continues. Confederate forts guarding New Orleans are attacked by a Union fleet under Commodore David Farragut. On April 28, 1862, after sailing through a heavy barrage of enemy cannon fire, Farragut and his men captured the city. From New Orleans, the Union fleet moves up the Mississippi as far as Vicksburg to await the arrival of additional Union land forces. In the West, the Union has made significant advances. But the campaign in the East has barely begun. Lincoln has appointed General George McClellan as the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, with orders to launch a second attack on Richmond, Virginia. McClellan has spent several months training his new recruits and molding them into an effective army. President Lincoln is convinced that the troops are ready for battle, but McClellan hesitates to begin his advance. Overly cautious, he is convinced that the enemy force is much larger than it really is. Finally, in late March 1862, McClellan's army begins a slow advance toward Richmond. But General Robert E. Lee has prepared a brilliant plan to counter the Union advance. Under Lee's orders, General Stonewall Jackson, the hero of Bull Run, will create a diversion by attacking a Union army in the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson's maneuver makes it appear that the South is planning an attack on Washington, D.C. But after several thousand Union troops have been called back to protect Washington, Jackson marches his army toward Richmond to join Lee, who has taken charge as field commander. They will attack McClellan's army, which has been waiting for reinforcements. June 1862. In the 7 days' battles, McClellan's army is defeated and forced to retreat. The second attack on Richmond has failed. Lee has now decided on a basic change in strategy. Instead of fighting a mainly defensive war, he will attempt to weaken the enemy by taking the offensive. Lee's troops march first to Manassas, and here on August 30th, they defeat a Union army in the Second Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates then advance into Union territory, quickly capturing Frederick, Harper's Ferry, and Hagerstown. In Washington, as the Eastern Campaign continues to worsen for the Union, President Lincoln confers with his cabinet on a basic change in political strategy. He has said many times that the war is being fought to preserve the Union and not to abolish slavery. But since the start of the war, many slaves have escaped from their masters and entered Union Army camps. At first, these runaways were returned to their masters. Then, Union General Benjamin Butler declared escaped slaves in his camp to be contraband of war, property lawfully seized from the enemy. The contrabands have been put to work in Union Army camps, and Butler's action has been approved and extended by Congress. A Confiscation Act passed in July 1862 declares that all slaves of masters supporting the Confederacy are to be forever free. By September 1862, many Northerners are calling for an even stronger move to abolish slavery. Such an action would win strong approval in England and France and could end the threat of European support for the Confederacy. Lincoln has prepared a draft of an Emancipation Proclamation, but since the war is going badly for the Union, he feels that issuing the proclamation would appear to be an act of desperation. He will wait until the Confederates can be driven out of Maryland. September 17, 1862, near Antietam Creek in Maryland, the opposing armies meet. In 12 hours of combat, both sides sustain heavy losses, and neither gains a decisive advantage. But Lee's army will withdraw and return to Virginia. Lincoln feels that the Confederate retreat is at least a partial victory for the Union, and 5 days later, he announces a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The final proclamation will be issued on January 1st, 1863. On that date, in all states or parts of states in rebellion against the Union, all slaves will be forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation will be welcomed and celebrated by those who oppose slavery. But to make the proclamation effective, the North must win the Civil War. In the West, at the end of 1862, Grant has failed in his first attempt to capture Vicksburg. In the East, a third attempt to capture Richmond has also failed. For both North and South, the war began enthusiastically with the expectation of rapid success. But after 2 years, the decisive battles are yet to be fought, and Americans face 2 more years of bitter civil war.